What's the biggest promise your parents broke? My dad, Demetrius, promised he'd never miss my graduation. He said it the day I started college, gripping my shoulders like he was making a blood oath. Even if the world's ending, I'll be there. Mom, Anastasia rolled her eyes and told him to stop being dramatic, but I believed him. He'd missed my high school graduation because of work, missed my soccer championships, my science fair win. But college was different. This was the big one. 4 years passed. I sent Demetrius updates about every test, every paper, every small victory. He'd text back with thumbs up emojis and proud of you, kiddo. The morning of graduation, I ironed my cap and gown 3 times, kept checking my phone. He texted at 6 a.m. Flight lands at noon. Save me a seat, front row. The ceremony started at 2 p.m. I sat in the staging area with 500 other graduates, but I kept turning around, scanning the crowd. Front row, 3rd seat from the left, empty. Maybe his flight was delayed. Maybe traffic was bad. Maybe he was parking. When they called my name, I walked across that stage, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with the dean. But inside, something cracked. I looked at that empty seat one more time. Nothing. After the ceremony, I checked my phone. 17 missed calls from an unknown number. 1 voicemail. But it wasn't Demetrius's voice. It was Anastasia, using someone else's phone because hers died. Honey, there's been an accident. We're at St. Mary's Hospital, room 4B. Come right away. I don't remember driving there. Just remember running through those hospital doors, still wearing my cap and gown, past nurses who tried to stop me. Found room 4B. Demetrius was awake, bandaged, hooked to machines. His rental car got T-boned 2 blocks from the university. He'd been conscious the whole time, kept telling the paramedics he needed to get to his daughter's graduation, even attempted to walk out of the ER. The nurse told me he made them prop him up so he could watch the ceremony on his phone through the university's live stream. Said he cried when they called my name. Said he kept whispering, "That's my baby," to anyone who'd listen. I sat on the edge of his bed. He grabbed my hand with his good one. Tubes and wires everywhere. "I'm sorry," he said. "I promised I'd be there." I looked at his phone on the bedside table. The live stream was still open, paused on a blurry image of me crossing the stage. The battery was at 3%. He'd watched the whole thing. "You were there," I said. And for the first time in 4 years, I actually meant it. But that's not where the story ends. That's just where I thought it ended. Sitting in that sterile hospital room with a smell of disinfectant burning my nose and machines beeping their steady rhythm around us. I had no idea that conversation would be the last real one we'd have for months. The doctors said Dad's injuries were extensive but not life-threatening. Broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding that required surgery, and a severe concussion. They moved him to ICU the next morning when complications developed. I called my job at the marketing firm and told them I needed time off. My supervisor, Marcus, wasn't thrilled about it, especially since we were in the middle of launching a campaign for a major client, but he gave me a week. Mom flew in from Phoenix that evening. She'd been living there since the divorce when I was 16, working as a real estate agent and dating some guy named Rick who sold insurance. I picked her up from the airport, and the drive back to the hospital was awkward as hell. We hadn't spent more than a few hours together since I'd started college. "How's he really doing?" she asked, staring out the passenger window. "They say he'll recover. Surgery went well, just needs time." She nodded, but I could see her reflection in the window and she looked worried. Really worried. The kind of worried that made me realize maybe things weren't as simple as the doctors were making them sound. When we got to ICU, visiting hours were almost over. Dad was unconscious, breathing through a tube, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Mom stood at the foot of his bed for a long time without saying anything. Then she pulled out her phone and started making calls about extending her stay in town. That first week stretched into 2, then 3. Dad would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to squeeze my hand or try to talk around the breathing tube, sometimes completely gone. The doctor said it was normal with head injuries, but watching him struggle to remember my name or where he was never stopped feeling like a punch to the gut. I was burning through my savings, staying in a hotel near the hospital. My apartment was 3 hours away, and I couldn't bear the thought of being that far from him. Mom was staying with her sister Linda across town, and we'd meet at the hospital every morning around 8, sit with Dad until visiting hours ended at 9 p.m., then go our separate ways. During those long hours sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs, Mom and I started talking, really talking, for the first time in years. She told me about Phoenix, about Rick, about how she'd been thinking about Dad more than she wanted to admit. I told her about my job, about the girl I'd been seeing named Sarah, who'd broken up with me 2 months before graduation because she said I was emotionally unavailable, about how I'd been feeling lost since college ended. "Your father always talked about you," she said one afternoon while Dad slept. "Every time we talked on the phone, every holiday when he'd call to say happy whatever, it was always about something you'd accomplished or something funny you'd said. I used to get a little jealous, honestly. Jealous. You two had this bond. Even after the divorce, even when he was working those crazy hours, you never doubted that he loved you. I envied that certainty. I didn't know what to say to that. The certainty she was talking about had been tested plenty of times. All those missed events, all those promises that work emergencies had derailed. But sitting there watching Dad fight to breathe, I realized she was right. Underneath all the disappointment, I'd never actually doubted that he loved me. The breakthrough came in week 4. Dad had been awake more often, and the doctors were talking about removing the breathing tube. I was reading him updates from his work emails. He'd insisted I check them, even though his boss had told everyone he was on indefinite medical leave. Mom had gone down to the cafeteria to get coffee. "Marcus," Dad said suddenly, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "What about Marcus?" I asked, thinking he was confused. "Your boss, Marcus Chen. Worked with with him 10 years ago at Peterson Industries. Good guy. Tell him, I said. Tell him to take care of my boy. I stared at him. You know Marcus. Dad tried to smile around the tubes. Small world. Kept an eye on you from a distance. Made sure you landed somewhere good. My stomach dropped. Dad, did you have something to do with me getting that job? He closed his eyes, and for a moment, I thought he'd fallen asleep again. Then he whispered, just put in a good word. You earned it on your own. I felt like the floor was tilting. My first real job after college, the one I'd been so proud of landing, the one that had finally made me feel like an adult capable of taking care of himself, and Dad had been pulling strings behind the scenes. When Mom came back with coffee, she took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I told her what Dad had said about Marcus, about the job, about keeping an eye on me from a distance. Oh, honey, she said, sitting down heavily in her chair. There's more. Over the next hour, while Dad slept, Mom told me about all the ways he'd been involved in my life without me knowing. The scholarship that had paid for most of my college tuition. He'd been making anonymous donations to the fund for 4 years. The apartment I'd rented senior year when my roommate flaked and I couldn't afford the full rent alone, Dad had quietly paid the difference directly to the landlord. The car that had miraculously been repaired for half the quoted price when my transmission died sophomore year, he'd called in a favor with a mechanic friend. But why didn't he tell me? I asked. Because he knew you needed to feel independent. He knew you needed to believe you were making it on your own. And you were, mostly. He just smoothed out a few rough edges. I felt angry and grateful and confused, all at the same time. Part of me wanted to shake him awake and demand to know what else he'd done that I didn't know about. Part of me wanted to thank him for caring enough to watch out for me, even when I was pushing him away. The breathing tube came out the next day. Dad's voice was raspy and weak, but he could talk in short sentences. The first thing he said to me was, "Don't be mad about the job thing." "I'm not mad," I lied. "I'm just processing." Good kid. Always overthought everything. He managed a small smile. Gets it from his mother. Hey, Mom protested from her chair. I resemble that remark. It was the first time I'd heard them joke with each other since the divorce. Something about Dad lying there so vulnerable, so dependent on machines and monitors, had stripped away whatever anger and resentment had been keeping them distant for all these years. Over the next few days, as Dad got stronger, more pieces of the picture started coming together. He'd been planning to semi-retire after my graduation, had been saving money for years, working those long hours and missing those events because he was building a foundation that would let him step back and spend more time with family. The trip to my graduation was supposed to be the first step in that new phase of his life. Had it all figured out, he told me one afternoon when the physical therapist was helping him sit up in bed. Was going to surprise you. Tell you after the ceremony. Maybe we could take a trip together this summer. Go somewhere we'd always talked about but never had time for. Where did you want to go? I asked. Alaska. You remember? When you were 12, you saw that documentary about salmon fishing and wouldn't shut up about it for months. Said we should go to Alaska and catch a fish bigger than both of us put together. I did remember. I'd been obsessed with the idea of us roughing it in the wilderness, proving ourselves against nature. Dad had promised we'd do it someday when work slowed down. Someday that had never come. We could still do that, I said. When you get better. Dad looked at me for a long moment. Would you want to? Even knowing about all the interference. I thought about it. About the job recommendation, the scholarship money, the apartment rent, the car repair. About all the ways he'd been trying to take care of me while letting me believe I was taking care of myself. Yeah, I said finally. I think I would. The recovery was slower than any of us had expected. Dad developed pneumonia in week 6, which set everything back. I'd used up all my vacation time and had to go back to work, driving the 3 hours each way on weekends to visit. Mom extended her stay indefinitely, which meant having some difficult conversations with Rick about their relationship. Marcus was more understanding about my situation than I'd expected. When I finally worked up the courage to ask him about knowing my father, he admitted they'd worked together years ago. Demetrius called me when you applied, Marcus said during our one-on-one meeting. Didn't ask for any favors, just wanted to let me know you were his son. Said he thought you'd be a good fit but wanted me to make the decision based purely on your qualifications. And you hired me because your portfolio was impressive and you interviewed well. Your father's endorsement was just a nice bonus. The fact that he raised someone with integrity was a point in your favor, not the deciding factor. That made me feel a little better, but I was still wrestling with the larger questions about independence and self-reliance. How much of my success was really mine? How much had been quietly facilitated by someone else's unseen efforts? I brought these concerns up with Dr. Sarah Kim, the therapist I'd started seeing to deal with everything that had happened. She was a few years older than me, calm and thoughtful in a way that reminded me of my old college advisor. Support systems aren't the same thing as dependence, she told me during one of our sessions. Your father didn't do your work for you or make your decisions. He just tried to remove some obstacles that might have derailed your progress. There's a difference, but I didn't know about it. Doesn't that matter? It matters in terms of how you feel about the help, but it doesn't diminish what you accomplished. You still had to perform at your job, still had to pass your classes, still had to navigate relationships and challenges and setbacks. Financial support doesn't create character or competence. Slowly, I started to see her point. Dad hadn't been trying to control my life or make me dependent on him. He'd been trying to love me in the way he knew how, by working to clear a path for me to succeed on my own terms. By week 8, Dad was moved out of ICU and into a regular room. The doctors said he could probably go home in another week or two, but he'd need months of physical therapy and couldn't live alone during his recovery. That sparked a series of complicated conversations about what came next. Dad's house was a split-level ranch in the suburbs, not particularly wheelchair accessible. He'd need help with basic tasks for a while, and someone to drive him to appointments. Mom's life was in Phoenix, but she'd been away for almost 2 months already. I could take family leave from work, but that would mean using up the rest of my savings and potentially jeopardizing my career momentum. Maybe I should look into a rehabilitation center, Dad suggested when we were discussing options. Somewhere with professional staff. You two shouldn't have to rearrange your whole lives. That's not happening, I said immediately. We'll figure something else out. Your mother has her own life to get back to, and you've got your career to think about. I won't be the reason you derail your future. Dad, you spent 4 years working overtime to build a foundation for my future. The least I can do is take a few months to help you recover. Mom had been quiet during this conversation, staring out the window at the parking lot. Finally, she spoke up. What if I stayed, she said, just temporarily, until you're back on your feet? Dad and I both looked at her in surprise. Anna, you can't put your life on hold indefinitely, Dad said. It's not indefinite, it's a few months. And honestly, she paused, still looking out the window. Things with Rick have been strained anyway. Maybe some time apart would be good for us. Help us figure out if what we have is worth keeping. What about your job? I can work remotely for a while. Most of my clients communicate by phone and email anyway, and Linda said I could stay with her as long as I need to. I could see Dad struggling with accepting help, the same way I'd struggled with learning about all the ways he'd helped me. Pride was apparently a family trait. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly. This isn't about owing, Mom replied. This is about wanting to. For the first time in years, I want to be here. The day Dad came home from the hospital was a Tuesday in late June. I'd taken the day off work to help him get settled. Mom had spent the weekend making his house more accessible, moving furniture, setting up a temporary bedroom on the first floor, stocking the kitchen with easy-to-prepare meals. Watching my parents work together to navigate Dad's limitations was strange and touching. They'd been divorced for 6 years, had barely spoken except for logistics about my graduation or holidays, but there was an ease between them now, a familiarity that had survived all the anger and disappointment of their marriage falling apart. You remember how to work the coffee maker? Mom asked, showing Dad the machine she'd moved to a lower counter so he could reach it from his wheelchair. I think I can manage coffee, Dad said dryly. It's not rocket science, says the man who once tried to make pancakes and somehow set off the smoke alarm. That was one time, and the batter was thicker than I expected. I found myself smiling, listening to them bicker about Dad's cooking skills. It felt like being a kid again, before the fights and the silences and the lawyers. That evening, I was helping Dad with his exercises when he brought up the Alaska trip again. I was serious about that, you know. When I'm cleared for travel, if you still want to go, of course I want to go. But are you sure you'll be up for roughing it in the wilderness? Dad laughed, wincing a little because his ribs were still tender. Son, I've been roughing it in corporate America for 25 years. A few days fishing in Alaska sounds like luxury. We should start planning it, I said. Give us something to look forward to. Already started. Dad gestured toward a stack of travel brochures on his nightstand. Your mother picked those up for me yesterday. Apparently, she remembers your salmon fishing obsession too. I flipped through the brochures full of pictures of pristine lakes and mountains, and guys holding enormous fish. It all looked impossibly perfect, like something from a movie about father-son bonding. When were you thinking? Late summer, fall. I was thinking next spring, actually. Give me time to get back to full strength, and it'll give you time to save up vacation days without Marcus getting annoyed. The fact that he was thinking that far ahead, making long-term plans, felt like a promise in itself. Not the kind of promise that could be broken by car accidents or medical emergencies, but the kind that meant he was planning to stick around for a while. Over the next few weeks, I fell into a routine. Work Monday through Friday, drive up Friday evening to spend the weekend helping Dad with errands and appointments. Mom was there full-time, and between the two of us, we managed to keep him fed, medicated, and moderately entertained. Physical therapy was going well. Dad was determined to walk without assistance by the time he went back to work, which his doctor said could happen as early as October if he kept progressing. He threw himself into the exercises with the same intensity he'd always brought to work projects, tracking his progress on charts and setting increasingly ambitious goals. He's being ridiculous, Mom told me one Saturday afternoon while Dad napped. The physical therapist said 20 minutes of walking practice a day. Yesterday, I caught him doing 45 minutes. His leg was shaking by the end. That sounds like Dad. It sounds like someone who's afraid of being seen as weak or dependent. I looked at her carefully. Is that why you and he split up? Because he couldn't handle needing help. Mom was quiet for a long moment, folding and refolding a dish towel. Partly, she said finally. Your father has always needed to be the provider, the problem solver, the one who takes care of everyone else. When I lost my job 8 years ago and couldn't find anything that paid enough, I wanted to go back to school, maybe get a degree in something practical. He saw it as his failure that I needed to do that. But that doesn't make sense. It made sense to him. He started working longer hours, taking on more projects, trying to earn enough that I wouldn't have to work at all. Meanwhile, I was sitting at home feeling useless and invisible. We stopped talking about anything real. He'd come home exhausted and stressed. I'd be frustrated and lonely. After a while, we were just two people living in the same house, politely avoiding each other. Why didn't you just tell him you wanted to work? I tried, but he heard it as criticism of his ability to provide. He heard it as me saying he wasn't enough. And maybe in some ways I was saying that, not that he wasn't enough as a person, but that his vision of what our life should look like wasn't enough for me. I thought about this while we prepared dinner, about how Dad's need to take care of people had shaped so much of his life, including his relationship with me. The secret financial help, the career networking, the promises to be present that he'd made and then broken when work demanded more of his time. Do you think he's different now? I asked. After after the accident. Mom considered this, stirring a pot of soup she'd been simmering all afternoon. I think he's more aware of his limitations, and maybe more willing to accept help, though he's still fighting it. Yesterday I caught him trying to vacuum one-handed rather than ask me to do it. That evening, the three of us sat on Dad's back deck watching the sunset. He was in his wheelchair, legs propped up on a footrest, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. Mom was reading a real estate magazine, occasionally reading aloud about properties that sounded ridiculously expensive or weird. Listen to this, she said. Underground house built into a hillside, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a view of the neighbor's septic tank. Only $400,000. That's not that bad for this market, Dad said. Demetrius, it's underground. You'd be living like a mole person. Some of the best houses in Tuscany are built into hillsides. This is not Tuscany. This is Ohio. I found myself laughing at their easy banter. The way they could disagree about real estate without it turning into a fight about deeper incompatibilities. Maybe time apart had given them perspective on what had gone wrong between them. Or maybe the crisis of Dad's accident had reminded them of what had gone right in the first place. What about you? Dad asked me. Any thoughts about settling down? Finding a nice underground house for yourself? I'm barely making rent on a studio apartment. Homeownership feels pretty theoretical right now. You're only 22, Mom said. You've got time to figure things out. 23 next month, I corrected. Your birthday. Dad sat up straighter. We should do something special. Make up for graduation being such a disaster. Dad, graduation wasn't a disaster. You were there, just not in the way we expected. Still, I want to do something. A proper celebration. Like what? Dad got that look he always got when he was planning something elaborate. Let me think about it. Mom and I exchanged glances. Dad's idea of celebration tended toward the grandiose, even when his resources were limited. For my high school graduation, which he'd missed due to a work emergency, he'd tried to make up for it by surprising me with a weekend trip to Chicago. We'd ended up staying in a hotel that was way too expensive and eating at restaurants that cost more than my monthly allowance. It had been fun but also stressful watching him spend money he probably didn't have. Nothing too crazy, I said. I'm happy just having everyone in the same place at the same time. That's not enough, Dad insisted. Birthdays should be memorable. Trust me, this whole summer has been memorable enough. But I could see he was already mentally planning something, the way his eyes got distant and focused when he was working through logistics. I made a mental note to talk to Mom about keeping his birthday plans reasonable. The following week brought new complications. Dad's company called to discuss his return to work timeline. They'd been patient about his medical leave, but they needed to know if he was planning to come back or if they should start looking for a permanent replacement. Dad was optimistic about returning in the fall, but his doctor was more cautious. The head injury had affected his concentration and short-term memory in ways that might not be compatible with his demanding job. Dr. Peterson, the neurologist, recommended neuropsychological testing to evaluate Dad's cognitive abilities before he made any commitments about returning to work. The testing took a full day and covered everything from memory and attention to problem-solving and processing speed. Dad came home exhausted and discouraged. Felt like taking the SATs again. He told me over the phone that night, except my brain felt like it was running through mud. What did the neuropsychologist say? Won't have results for another week. But she kept asking me to repeat instructions and double-check my work. That's not a good sign. I could hear the fear in his voice. Dad's identity was so wrapped up in his professional competence, in being the person who solved problems and managed complex projects. The possibility that those abilities might be permanently compromised was terrifying to him. Even if there are some changes, that doesn't mean you can't work, I said. Maybe just different work, or the same work with accommodations. I've been doing project management for 15 years. I don't know how to do anything else. Dad, you rebuilt a transmission when I was 10 because you didn't want to pay a mechanic. You taught yourself electrical work when the house needed rewiring. You figured out how to use social media to promote my high school fundraisers. You're the most adaptable person I know. That's different. Those were just hobbies. No, those were examples of you learning new skills when you needed them. If you need to learn new ways to work, you'll figure it out. There was a long pause. Then Dad said, "When did you get so wise?" Probably from watching you solve problems my whole life. The test results came back the following Wednesday. Dr. Peterson called Dad in for an appointment to discuss them, and he asked me to come with him. Mom volunteered to drive us since Dad still wasn't cleared for driving. Dr. Peterson's office was in a medical building that smelled like coffee and anxiety. The waiting room was full of people who looked like they were dealing with things they'd never expected to deal with. Brain injuries apparently were equal opportunity disruptors. When our name was called, we followed Dr. Peterson into an office lined with diplomas and brain models. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes and a direct way of speaking that I appreciated. The good news, she said, spreading Dad's test results across her desk, is that your core cognitive abilities are intact. Your intelligence, reasoning skills, and long-term memory are all within normal ranges. Dad leaned forward. And the bad news, you're having some difficulties with working memory and sustained attention. Tasks that require you to hold multiple pieces of information in your head simultaneously or maintain focus for extended periods are more challenging than they were before the injury. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means that Demetrius might find it harder to manage complex, multi-step projects the way he used to. Conference calls with multiple participants might be overwhelming. Switching between tasks rapidly could be more difficult. Dad was quiet, absorbing this information. Is it permanent? He asked finally. It's hard to say. Some people see continued improvement for months or even years after a brain injury. But it's also possible that this represents your new baseline. The key is learning to work with your current abilities rather than fighting against the changes. Dr. Peterson spent the next 20 minutes talking about accommodations and strategies, written instructions instead of verbal ones, regular breaks during long meetings, tools for organizing and prioritizing tasks. It all sounded reasonable in theory, but I could see Dad struggling with the reality of needing these kinds of supports. In the car afterward, Mom and I tried to be encouraging. Lots of people use organizational tools, Mom said. It doesn't mean you're not capable. Everyone at my level uses assistance and project management software, I added. This isn't that different. Dad nodded, but he looked defeated. I just need some time to process this. That evening, I found him on the back deck again, staring into the yard without really seeing anything. He had a beer in his hand, barely touched. How are you doing? I asked, settling into the chair next to him. Honestly, I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. I didn't know what to say to that. Dad had always been the person with answers, with plans, with solutions. Seeing him uncertain and vulnerable was disorienting for me too. You're still the same person, I said finally. You're just dealing with some new challenges. Am I though? If I can't do my job the way I used to, if I can't remember things the way I used to, what's left? Everything else. You're still the person who drove 3 hours to watch me play soccer when I was 12. You're still the person who taught me how to change a tire and how to negotiate and how to treat people with respect. You're still the person who fought to get to my graduation even when he was bleeding in a hospital bed. Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I wanted to give you everything, every opportunity, every advantage. I wanted to make sure you never had to struggle the way I did. Dad, you did give me everything that mattered. Maybe not everything I wanted in the moment, but everything I needed to become who I am. Even missing all those events, even working all those nights and weekends. I thought about this carefully, about the anger I'd felt as a kid when Dad wasn't there for things that seemed important, about the resentment that had built up over the years, about how my perspective had shifted since learning about all the ways he'd been supporting me from behind the scenes. I used to think being there meant physically showing up, I said, but I'm starting to understand that there are different ways to be present in someone's life. You were always working towards something for our family, even when it meant missing individual moments. I should have found a better balance, maybe, but you were doing the best you could with what you knew at the time, and it's not too late to find that balance now. Dad took a sip of his beer, the first time I'd seen him touch it since we'd sat down. The Alaska trip, he said. I really want to do that, even if I'm not exactly the same person I was when I first promised it. Especially because you're not the same person. This version of you, the one who's learning to accept help and ask for support, might be even better company on a fishing trip. Dad smiled for the first time all day. When did you become the parent in this relationship? Probably around the time you started needing help remembering to take your medications. Fair point. The next few weeks brought more adjustments. Dad met with his supervisor to discuss a modified return to work plan. They agreed on a part-time schedule with reduced responsibilities, at least initially. He'd be working with a team instead of leading projects independently, which was hard for his ego but probably realistic given his current limitations. Mom's situation in Phoenix was getting more complicated. Rick was pressuring her to come back, threatening to end their relationship if she didn't return by the end of the summer. Her real estate business was suffering from her absence, and her savings were running low. I can't ask you to sacrifice your life for mine, Dad told her when she brought up these pressures. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Nana, be practical. You've got a career, a relationship, a whole life in Phoenix. Do I, though? I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about what I actually want versus what I settled for after our divorce. I was sitting at Dad's kitchen table, pretending to read a book while listening to their conversation. They'd gotten more comfortable talking about personal things in front of me, maybe because the crisis had erased some of the normal boundaries. What do you mean? Dad asked. I mean that I moved to Phoenix because it felt like a fresh start. New place, new job, new relationship. But it never felt like home. It felt like running away. From what? From here. From us. From the failure of our marriage and all the ways we'd hurt each other. Dad was quiet for a moment. Do you regret leaving? I regret how we ended things. I regret that we couldn't find a way to fix what was broken instead of just walking away. I regret that we wasted 6 years being polite strangers when we could have been figuring out how to be friends. Are we friends now? Dad asked. Mom smiled. I think we're getting there. That conversation seemed to shift something between them. They started spending more time together, not just managing Dad's care, but actually enjoying each other's company. They'd watch movies in the evening, cook dinner together, take short walks around the neighborhood when Dad felt up to it. I found it encouraging and confusing at the same time. Part of me hoped they might find their way back to each other, but part of me worried about what would happen if they tried and failed again. I'd been through their divorce once already. I wasn't sure I could handle watching them break each other's hearts a second time. My birthday fell on a Thursday, and Dad had been mysteriously busy all week making phone calls and arrangements for something he refused to discuss. Mom claimed not to know what he was planning, but I caught her hiding shopping bags in her car trunk, so I knew she was involved. Just promise me it's not going to be embarrassing, I said the night before. Define embarrassing, Dad replied. Anything involving surprise parties, singing waiters, or home videos from my childhood. Well, there goes my first 3 ideas. The next morning, Dad presented me with a card at breakfast. Inside was a printout of airline confirmation numbers and hotel reservations. Alaska, I said, scanning the details. Dad, this is in 2 weeks. Are you sure you're up for this? Dr. Peterson cleared me for travel as long as I take breaks and don't overdo it. And I figured if I waited until I was 100% better, we might be waiting forever. I looked at the itinerary. 5 days in Anchorage and the surrounding area, fishing guides, hotel rooms with accessible features, transportation arranged. This must have cost a fortune. I've been saving for this trip for 2 years, and after everything that's happened, I realized that experiences are more valuable than anything else I could spend money on. Mom was smiling from across the table. There's more, she said. More. Dad pulled out another set of papers. I booked 3 tickets. I looked at Mom in surprise. You're coming too. If you don't mind the company, I figured someone should be there to make sure your father doesn't try to wrestle any bears. I'm not going to wrestle bears, Dad protested. You're the man who tried to change a tire in a thunderstorm because you didn't want to wait for AAA. I don't trust your judgment about personal safety. I found myself laughing, imagining the 3 of us on some absurd family adventure. It wasn't what I'd pictured when Dad first mentioned Alaska, but somehow it felt perfect. When do we leave? I asked. 2 weeks from Saturday. Think you can get the time off work? I thought about Marcus, about the projects I'd be leaving behind, about the client presentations I'd need to reschedule. Then I thought about Dad in that hospital bed, about all the promises that had been broken and kept in unexpected ways, about the uncertainty of how much time any of us really had. I'll make it work, I said. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Dad researched fishing techniques and weather patterns with the intensity he'd once brought to work projects. Mom bought outdoor gear and studied maps of Alaska like she was planning a military operation. I arranged coverage for my responsibilities at work and tried not to think about how much this trip was going to impact my already strained finances. 3 days before we were supposed to leave, Dad had a setback. He'd been pushing himself too hard in physical therapy, determined to be in perfect shape for the trip, and he re-injured his back. Dr. Martinez, his physiatrist, was concerned about him traveling so soon. The vertebral fractures have healed well, she explained during an emergency appointment, but the surrounding muscles are still vulnerable. Long flights and physical activity could cause significant problems. Dad looked like someone had told him Christmas was canceled. What if I take it easy? No heavy lifting, no strenuous hiking. Demetrius, fishing involves standing for long periods, casting, potentially fighting large fish. It's not exactly low-impact activity. So what are you saying? Cancel the trip? Dr. Martinez looked at the 3 of us. I'm saying that you need to be realistic about your limitations. You could still go, but you'd need to modify your expectations significantly. In the car afterward, Dad was quiet and obviously disappointed. We could postpone, I suggested. Go in the spring like you originally planned. No, he said firmly. I'm not postponing this again. We'll just adapt. Easier fishing spots, more rest breaks, whatever it takes. Are you sure? Mom asked. There's no shame in waiting until you're stronger. Anna, I've been waiting to take this trip with my son for 10 years. I'm not waiting anymore. That determination, that refusal to let circumstances derail his plans, was vintage Dad. It was the same stubborn persistence that had driven him to watch my graduation from a hospital bed, that had made him work overtime for years to build financial security for our family, that had led him to secretly support my independence while letting me believe I was doing everything on my own. We left for Alaska on a Saturday morning in late August. The flight was long and uncomfortable for Dad, even in the aisle seat with extra legroom. By the time we reached Anchorage, he was exhausted and sore. But when we stepped outside the airport and saw the mountains in the distance, his face lit up like a kid's. Look at that, he said, pointing toward Denali in the far distance. We're really here. The hotel was nice, with accessible rooms and a restaurant that promised fresh seafood. Dad insisted on going out for dinner our first night, even though Mom and I could see he was tired. We're in Alaska, he said. We're eating salmon. Dinner was actually perfect. Dad ordered the largest piece of salmon on the menu and managed to finish most of it despite having no appetite during his recovery. Mom told stories about her childhood camping trips with her father, and I shared my memories of that documentary that had started the whole Alaska obsession. You were so serious about it, Dad said. Drew diagrams of different types of fishing lures, made lists of what gear we'd need. I kept all those papers, you know. You did, in a folder in my desk drawer, along with every report card, every soccer team photo, every college acceptance letter. Someday when you have kids, you'll understand the impulse to save everything. The next morning, we met our fishing guide, a woman named Captain Sarah, who looked like she could wrestle the bears Mom was worried about. She took one look at Dad's wheelchair and the way he moved carefully, and immediately started adapting her usual routine. We'll take the boat to a nice calm spot, she said. Plenty of fish, easy casting, comfortable seating. No need to prove anything to anybody. The boat ride out to the fishing spot was incredible. Mountains reflected in perfectly still water, eagles circling overhead, the kind of pristine wilderness that makes you understand why people fall in love with Alaska. Dad sat in the bow with his camera, taking pictures of everything. When we reached the fishing spot, Captain Sarah set up a chair for Dad that would support his back and keep him stable while casting. She showed us how to use the equipment, how to read the water for signs of fish, how to be patient and observant. Fishing isn't about catching fish, she said. It's about being present in a beautiful place with people you care about. The fish are just a bonus. We spent 4 hours on the water. Dad caught 3 decent-sized salmon. I managed to land 2, and Mom surprised everyone by catching the biggest fish of the day. But Captain Sarah was right. The fishing was just a bonus. The real point was sitting together in that boat, talking and laughing and being fully present with each other. This is what I wanted, Dad said during a quiet moment while we were waiting for bites. Just this, time together without distractions. No work emergencies, I asked. No work emergencies, no schedule conflicts, no reasons to be anywhere else. Mom was smiling from her spot at the stern of the boat. Remember when you used to say that work was how you showed love, by providing for us? I remember. I also remember you trying to tell me that presence was a form of provision too. Took you a while to figure that out. 20 years, but who's counting? That evening, morning, we had our fish prepared at a local restaurant. Dad insisted on keeping the largest salmon to have it mounted, even though Mom pointed out that hanging a giant fish on his wall might limit his decorating options. It's not about decorating, he said. It's about remembering this day. Pretty sure you don't need a taxidermy fish to remember this day, I said. Humor an old man. You're 51, old enough to want a fish on my wall. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. Gentle adventures that accommodated Dad's limitations, but still felt like real experiences. A scenic train ride through Denali National Park, a visit to a glacier that we could access by car rather than hiking, a cultural center where we learned about native Alaskan traditions and art. Dad tired easily and needed frequent breaks, but he never complained or suggested cutting anything short. It was like he was determined to extract every possible moment of enjoyment from the trip, to make up for all the experiences he'd missed or postponed over the years. On our last night, we sat in the hotel lounge overlooking Cook Inlet, sharing a bottle of wine and comparing photos from the trip. Thank you, Dad said suddenly. Both of you, for making this happen. You planned the whole thing, Mom pointed out. I mean, for being here, for putting your lives on hold to take care of me these past few months, for being patient with me while I figured out how to accept help. Dad, you don't need to thank us for loving you. Maybe not, but I want to, and I want to apologize. For what? For all the times I chose work over family, for all the promises I broke because I thought providing was more important than being present, for making you feel like you had to earn my attention instead of just deserving it. I looked at him carefully. You don't need to apologize for working hard to take care of us. I need to apologize for thinking that was enough, for thinking that love was something you demonstrated through sacrifice instead of something you shared through presence. Mom reached over and took his hand. Demetrius, we all did the best we could with what we understood at the time. The important thing is that we're here now. Are we though? I mean, after this trip, after I'm back to work and you're back in Phoenix and life returns to normal, are we gonna stay connected? Or is this just a beautiful interlude? It was a fair question. The past few months had brought us together in ways that felt meaningful but also temporary. Crisis had a way of clarifying priorities and strengthening bonds, but what happened when the crisis passed? I've been thinking about that, Mom said, about what I want my life to look like going forward, and I think I want to move back. Not to our old house, not to try to recreate what we had before, but back to this area, where I can be closer to both of you. Dad looked surprised. What about Rick? What about your business in Phoenix? Rick and I had a long conversation last week. We both realized that if my being here for a few months was enough to threaten our relationship, then our relationship wasn't as solid as we thought. As for the business, I can do real estate anywhere. Maybe it's time for a fresh start. Where would you live? I asked. I don't know yet. Maybe rent something for a while. See how it feels. Linda said I could stay with her until I figure things out. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing this news. I don't want you to uproot your life because you feel obligated, he said finally. I'm not doing it out of obligation. I'm doing it because I realized that the life I built in Phoenix was nice, but it wasn't really mine. It was just a reaction to what went wrong here. I'd rather build something intentional. What does that look like? Mom smiled. I have no idea. That's what makes it interesting. The flight home was easier than the flight out, maybe because we were all more relaxed. Dad slept most of the way, exhausted from the trip but clearly satisfied. Mom worked on her laptop, researching real estate markets and job opportunities back home. I stared out the window and tried to process everything that had changed over the past few months. When we landed, I realized that I didn't want the trip to end. Not just the Alaska adventure, but this period of closeness and mutual care that had emerged from Dad's accident. We discovered ways of being together that worked, ways of supporting each other that didn't feel like burden or sacrifice. What happens now? I asked as we waited for our luggage. Now we go back to our regular lives, Dad said, but maybe with a better understanding of what matters. Are you nervous about going back to work? Terrified, he admitted, but also ready to try. And if it doesn't work out the way I hope, at least I know there are other options. Like what? Like early retirement, like consulting instead of full-time employment, like prioritizing different things than I've prioritized for the past 20 years. Mom was loading bags onto a cart, moving with efficient purpose. I put an offer on a house yesterday, she said casually. Dad and I both stared at her. You what? Dad asked. A small place about 15 minutes from your house. 2 bedrooms, nice yard, good bones but needs some updating. I figured if I'm going to move back, I should have a project to keep me busy. Anna, are you sure about this? As sure as I've been about anything in years. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we reached Dad's house, I helped carry luggage inside while Mom immediately started a load of laundry and began reorganizing the kitchen. It struck me that she moved through his space with familiar ease, like she'd never really left. Can I ask you something? I said to Dad while Mom was on the phone with Linda. Of course. Do you think you and Mom might? I mean, is there a chance you two could work things out? Dad considered this carefully. I think we're working things out. Maybe not in the way you mean, but in important ways. We're learning to be family again, but not together. I don't know. We're different people than we were when we got divorced. Maybe those different people are more compatible, or maybe those different people are better as friends than as married partners. Either way, we're not going anywhere. That felt like enough for now. The promise of continued connection, of intentional relationship, of presence in each other's lives. Not necessarily romance or reconciliation, but something deeper than polite co-parenting. Dad went back to work the following week, starting with half-days and limited responsibilities. His supervisor, Janet, had worked out a modified role that played to his strengths while accommodating his cognitive changes. Instead of managing large projects independently, he'd be part of a team, focusing on client relationships and strategic planning rather than detailed logistics. Alex, how's it going? I asked during our weekly phone call. Better than expected. Turns out that listening and asking questions are more valuable skills than I realized. I'm not the guy who remembers every deadline in detail anymore, but I'm apparently pretty good at understanding what clients actually need. That sounds like a promotion, not a demotion. It feels different than what I'm used to, but not bad different. More collaborative. Less pressure to have all the answers myself. Mom's house purchase went through quickly, and she spent September moving and renovating. I drove up most weekends to help with projects, painting, installing fixtures, arranging furniture. It was satisfying work, creating something beautiful and functional from something that had been neglected. You don't have to spend every weekend working on my house, she told me one Saturday while we were tiling a bathroom. I like it. It's a break from sitting at a computer all week, and it gives you an excuse to check on your father without seeming like you're checking on him. She wasn't wrong. Dad was doing well, but I still worried about him. The cognitive changes, the physical limitations, the major life adjustments. It was a lot for anyone to handle. Is that obvious? To me, probably not to him. He's enjoying having you around more often, even if he doesn't understand why. Things are better between us now, because you both stopped trying to prove things to each other. You stopped trying to prove you were independent. He stopped trying to prove he was indispensable. Now you can just enjoy each other's company. That insight felt profound and obvious at the same time. So much of our relationship had been shaped by unspoken competitions and unacknowledged fears. Dad afraid of not being needed, me afraid of being too dependent. The accident had forced us past those fears into something more honest and comfortable. October brought the first anniversary of my college graduation. I'd been dreading it, expecting it to be a painful reminder of everything that had gone wrong that day. Instead, Dad suggested we commemorate it by having dinner together. Him, Mom, and me. A do-over, I asked. A completion, he said. The celebration we never got to have. We went to a nice restaurant downtown, and Dad brought copies of the photos he'd taken from his hospital bed during the live stream. They were blurry and poorly framed, but you could see my face clearly as I walked across the stage. I've been meaning to get these printed properly, he said, handing me an envelope. For your apartment. Inside were professional prints of the photos, mounted and matted. In one of them, you could see my expression as I looked toward the empty seat where he was supposed to be sitting. I looked disappointed, but not defeated. Hopeful, even. Thank you, I said, and meant it. For what? For being there. For fighting to be there. For caring enough to make it matter. Dad smiled. The same smile I remembered from childhood when I'd accomplished something he was proud of. You know what I learned from that day, he said. What? That showing up isn't just about physical presence. It's about caring enough to find a way, even when circumstances make it impossible. You knew I was there because you knew I would have done anything to be there. Is that why you kept the photo as your wallpaper? I kept it because it reminded me of what really matters. Not the promise I broke, but the love that made the promise meaningful in the first place. Mom was crying quietly into her napkin, trying not to let us see. What? Dad asked gently. I'm just happy, she said. Happy that we found our way back to each other. All of us. Even if it took a car accident and a near-death experience to get here. Sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances. You two learning to accept help and ask for support. Me learning to choose what I want instead of what seems safe. Maybe we needed to almost lose everything to figure out what we actually valued. That night, driving home to my apartment, I thought about promises and how they work. Dad had promised to be at my graduation, and in the most literal sense, he'd broken that promise. But in every way that mattered, he'd kept it. He'd fought to be there. He'd found a way to witness the moment. He'd made it clear that my achievement was important to him. Maybe that's what love looks like in real life. Not perfect execution of grand gestures, but persistent effort to show up in whatever way circumstances allow. Not the absence of disappointment, but the presence of someone who cares enough to keep trying. The Alaska photos were already up on my bedroom wall, right next to the graduation photos Dad had given me. Both sets of images represented promises kept in unexpected ways. The trip we'd finally taken, despite health scares and logistical complications. The celebration we'd eventually had, despite missed ceremonies and hospital emergencies. I fell asleep that night thinking about next year, about the promises I wanted to make and keep, to visit Dad regularly, not just when he needed help, but because I enjoyed his company, to support Mom as she built her new life, not out of obligation, but out of love, to be present in ways that mattered, even when presence looked different than originally planned. Dad kept that screenshot as his phone wallpaper until the day he died. Never changed it, not once. But that day was still 23 years away, filled with Alaska trips and birthday celebrations and ordinary Tuesday dinners and all the small, imperfect ways we'd learned to show up for each other. Sometimes a broken promise teaches you more about love than a kept one ever could. Because Demetrius fought death itself, trying to keep his word. And if that's not being there, I don't know what is. But more than that, he taught me that being there isn't about perfect attendance or flawless execution. It's about caring enough to keep trying, to find new ways to show love when the old ways don't work, to adapt your definition of presence until it includes all the ways people can matter to each other. The promise he made that day wasn't really about graduation. It was about being the kind of father who shows up, who cares, who fights for the people he loves. And that promise, that one he kept every single day in ways I'm still discovering,